You've likely heard that prioritizing a good night of sleep is something that you should be doing to feel and function your best. But how important is it actually? Is it just something that would be kind of nice to do? Or is it absolutely vital to ensuring your overall health and well-being? On today's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, Julie and I sit down with world-renowned sleep expert Dr. Kirk Parsley to discuss sleep, why it's important, and how to go about making sure that you get your best night possible. We're going to cue the intro song and then we're going to dive right into this conversation. Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, here in Schaumburg, Illinois. Now, at Muscle Activation Schaumburg, we believe your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise that's geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. But we know that exercise is not the only piece of the puzzle, and that is why we are bringing you a phenomenal guest today, none other than Dr. Kirk Parsley. Doc Parsley served as an undersea medical officer at Naval Special Warfare Group 1 from June 2009 to January 2013. While there, he led the development and supervised the group's first sports medicine rehabilitation center. He is a former SEAL and received his medical degree from Bethesda Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences in 2004. He interned in obstetrics and gynecology at Balboa Naval Hospital, San Diego in 2005, and subsequently completed a Navy residency in hyperbarics and diving medicine in 2006. Doc Parsley has been a member of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine since 2006 and has served as Naval Special Warfare's expert on sleep medicine. In addition, he is certified in hormone modulation, also known as age management medicine. After leaving the Navy, he went into concierge medicine and consulting. He continues to consult for multiple corporations and professional athletes and teams. Doc Parsley lectures worldwide on sleep, wellness, and hormonal optimization. His philosophy for wellness is simple. In order to optimize our health and get the most out of our bodies and minds, we must live more closely to the way we evolved as a species. He believes that many diseases and disorders that we accept as inevitable in modern society are unnecessary complications of poor sleeping habits, living in a toxic environment, eating foods we are not designed to digest, and allowing stress to overwhelm us. His passion is to help his patients and clients achieve the highest quality of life possible and realize their health, performance, and longevity goals. Dr. Parsley, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me on. I feel very welcomed.
Our pleasure. Hey, so tell us more about how you got into medicine. Like, what was your upbringing like? What was your educational background like that steered you into medicine? I know we read through your bio, talked about your history going through the Navy, being a SEAL, but walk us through in your words. We want to hear that story.
Yeah, it's not your typical path. In fact, when I was writing my med school essays, I'll date myself. Well before the internet, we went out and we bought Kaplan books on how to, like, what schools to apply to and how to apply and all that other stuff. And there was always samples for essays and how to write essays, and everybody's essays were the same. Essentially, like something fascinated them early in life about pond water through a microscope or seeing a squirrel die or some little kid story. And I started my essay off with, when I was a kid, I wanted to be the Marlboro Man. This did not fit anything I was ever interested in. So my childhood kind of had two phases. My mother was divorced and single before I was even born, grew up with no father until I was about 8. And we were, just essentially dirt poor, trailer park, no shoes kind of poor. And then she got remarried and we moved kind of out on the skirts of a suburb in a small town in Texas. And I was a terrible student. I was a good athlete. I was very physical. I was strong. And I liked to play sports and I liked to do activities with, I had lots of friends and so forth. Liked to compete really, but I had zero interest in school, started getting D's and F's in third grade. Actually, after 4 years of high school, I was still a sophomore. I dropped out of high school, got a GED and joined the Navy to become a Navy SEAL because I heard that was the toughest training you could do and I was competitive and I wanted to do the toughest thing I could. This is well before SEALs had any sort of celebrity status. Nobody even knew what the heck a SEAL was. Years later, when I would tell people I was a SEAL, literally no one had any idea what I was talking about. They all thought it had something to do with SeaWorld. So anyway, I did that for 6 years. Met a girl, actually, she was in grad school, getting her master's in physical therapy. And I had always been interested in such things. I'd always read, anything I could to make myself a better athlete, to make myself stronger, better, whatever. And I used to take her textbooks on deployment and read kinesiology and anatomy and physiology and stuff. I probably understood 30% of it, but it was interesting to me. And so I thought maybe I would do that. Of course, I didn't even have a high school diploma yet. So I was stretching to go do anything, but I figured, maybe I'll do that. So when I got out of the Navy, it takes a couple of thousand volunteer hours just to apply to physical therapy school. So I started doing my volunteer hours at San Diego Sports Medicine Center, which was owned by Dr. Lee Rice at the time. I volunteered there for probably about 2 weeks, and then they hired me on as a PT aide. I did that the whole time I was in college. Pretty quickly decided I didn't want to be a physical therapist. It was a little too limited for me. But San Diego Sports Medicine Center was, it was a healthcare mecca. We had everything. We had MDs and DOs and orthopedic surgeons and sports med guys and FP guys. And we had, physical therapists and athletic trainers and chiropractors and massage therapists, podiatrists. We literally had it all. So it was a great place to be when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I got to shadow guys and gals there and spend time with them and figure out what suited my interests the most. Of course, being a doctor really seemed like a great idea, but it was something that I just thought was completely beyond my reach. But, several of the doctors there were consistently trying to talk me into going to medical school. And I kept telling them, pump the brakes, kiddo. I didn't graduate high school. Medical school is probably a little out there. Lee Rice, the owner of the clinic, overheard this conversation one day, and he comes out to me and he says, the question isn't, could you get in? The question is, would you go if you got in? And I was like, you're going to shame me into this. So I decided, I would. Of course I would. So I decided I was going to go for that. Not related to the story at all, just as an interesting aside. He's the one who talked me into, and trying to become a doctor. And then it was years later, I'd lost touch with him. It'd been, 15 years or something. And then when I was getting out of the Navy, I ended up joining his practice that was now a concierge practice. There was just him and one other doctor, and his one other doctor had to leave. And we had just recently run across each other again. I ended up going back to work for him and was for a while planning to be his successor and take that practice over, which was just an amazing sort of circle of life thing. Obviously it didn't end up happening, but back to the main point, when I decided to go to medical school, again, looking through Kaplan books and so forth to see what I was competitive for, I found out the military had their own school. I didn't know that. And I said, well, if they're going to pay me to go to medical school instead of the other way around, and I was already married, I already had a kid, I had another kid on the way, just made sense. And I figured I'll get back to the SEAL teams as a doctor there, and I can go give back to that community and pay my time back to the military, because that's the way the military works. They'll pay you and they'll train you to do all sorts of things, but then you owe them time. So I just knew on my time payback, I could go back to my community and help my guys out, and that's what I ended up doing. And that sort of serendipitously where I learned about sleep was working with those guys.
Yeah, and I mean, the interesting about it is the special forces training, they're not notoriously known for sleep. I would say it's kind of the opposite, right? Where you're going, days on end, weeks on end of sleep deprivation. So I do find that kind of interesting of that being the spot where you learned about sleep. Can you tell us more about that?
The irony is not lost on me either. I mean, I probably chose the two worst professions in the world for sleep, if you think about it. When we go through SEAL training, you go an entire week without sleep. We call that Hell Week. It's a Sunday evening to Friday afternoon. You don't get any sleep at all. And there's many reasons for that. Some they'll admit to, and some they won't admit to. But sure. I'm 100% convinced that part of it is to induce psychotic breaks in anybody who's susceptible to it. Right? That would just make sense, because that's the demographic, and most people who are, who sort of have any sort of genetic proclivity towards a genetic or towards a psychiatric or psychotic break, it happens after a prolonged period of stress and sleep deprivation. And so I think they're testing for that as part of it. But I know that wasn't really your point, but we do that, one, for that reason, also because it's very demotivating to be tired. Obviously, you're biochemically a mess, and you're metabolically a mess, and you just don't have your faculties. And if we can get you in a weakened state, we'll see if you'll cave. We'll see if you'll quit. Because we can't, our organization is way too small. We can't have one person quit. Like, just one person quitting kills everybody probably, right? So it's like, it's a zero tolerance game for that. And I think the medical education there's a component of that as well. I don't think the sleep is as wise of a decision in that testing field, but I do see the benefit of kind of the isolationism of being up late, being really tired, being really stressed, having a lot of responsibility on you, and like having to make decisions and think clearly and figure out if you're thinking clearly. And so I can see it being used as a tool, but it's also just hugely underappreciated. Both professions didn't value sleep. I didn't value sleep. I would love to say that I just figured all this out and I was so smart that I took care of myself better than other people, but I didn't. I learned about this when I was learning about it for the SEALs. Mm-hmm. So when I got back to the SEAL teams, I had this great foundation in sports medicine and orthopedic surgery, and my plan was to be an orthopedic surgeon. And I got there at an opportune time to build their sports medicine facility. I didn't physically build it, obviously, but I supervised it and supervised the build out of that. And we hired our very first physical therapist and our very first physical therapy aide and our very first nutritionist, our very first strength and conditioning coach, our very first athletic trainer, our very first chiropractor, like everything. Like we had no facilities whatsoever until we did all that. And then at that point, we hired great people. I mean, we got people from really high level college programs, from the Olympic Training Center, from professional sports. Then of course I was the dumbest guy in the room because I'd hired these world-renowned experts in what they do. In the true military fashion, when you're the dumbest person around, they put you in charge, right? So now you're a supervisor. So like now I'm supervising this clinic of people who know far more than I do about what they're doing. And I'm like, okay. But I had my office was in the clinic. It was a big facility, it had one side was like a proper rehab facility with all the normal stuff you would think. Then there was a hallway, and on the other side was what we called a bridge gym, which looked a lot like just a regular gym with a few adaptive pieces in there. And that was for people who, they were done with rehab. They could exercise. They just couldn't keep up with the group. So then they worked in this bridge gym with our trainer. And the hallway in between there had all the offices, and my office was in there. And SEALs are a lot like professional athletes in that they will, the worst thing you can do to them is put them on the bench. So they are not going to tell you the truth. If you can put them on the bench, they're not going to risk telling you anything that might risk them being put on the bench. So because I had been a SEAL, because I was a SEAL, I mean, more importantly, probably I was a SEAL with a good reputation who had been around, who had been a SEAL recently enough to where they knew people that I knew. They knew people that I'd worked with, and they knew SEALs that I'd trained with. They knew the SEALs that I'd worked with and deployed with. And so they trusted me, and they came in, they shut the door, and they're like, hey man, I need to tell you what's really going on with me. And this has been going on for 10 years, 10 years, and they're not telling anybody about it. And they start listing off, this litany of symptoms that I had no idea how to fix. I'm just like, I got nothing. Like I have worse than nothing. Like I don't even have a guess, because they come in there like, my memory's really going. I don't feel like I can pay attention. I can't concentrate. I'm really emotional. I get really snappy with my wife and my kids. I'm kind of an ass at work. Like I'm crying during Hallmark commercials. I'm working out, perfectly the way, like I'm working with the trainer, I'm working out, I'm working with the nutritionist, I'm eating perfectly, I'm taking all my supplements, I'm doing everything. I'm getting fatter, I'm getting weaker, I'm getting slower, I ache everywhere, I'm always tired, my motivation's terrible. And I'm like, uh, I don't know. Like, I don't know. One thing that they never complained about was sleep, though. That was interesting, right? Because of the community, right? The community standards on that. I just started taking these huge lab panels. I ended up getting in trouble for it because I get in trouble for everything. That's how I work. But I just, this is a shotgun approach. I'm just like, well, I'll just do everything I can think of, like just test everything. I'll see what's what. So I was doing literally like 100 serum markers and just sending them all out to, sending them over to the hospital to get all the blood drawn. It's a word of mouth community. So they would come and say, they'd talk, one of them would talk to their buddy and, they'd confide in them that they came and saw me and that, whatever we'd done was helpful, or, or at least that I seemed to be taking it seriously and trying to be helpful. And so they just kept calling, kept coming. And probably about the 100th guy who sat in my office and told me the same story. I mean, after 20 guys, I could have just had them sit down and say, all right, let me tell you your story. And I just like read it off because it was identical to, everybody looked the same. And about the 100th guy said something to me about taking Ambien. And I just had this really clear image of myself sitting in my office and just going, it seems like a lot of guys have said that. And I put a little note in the corner, the margin of the note. And I'm like, I'll look at that after. And I went on about my interview and I talked to him and all this. And then, I went back to my charts. Every single person who had come in my office was taking Ambien.
Oh, interesting.
And not a single person who came in my office had mentioned anything about sleep, but they were all taking Ambien.
Yeah.
And I thought, I wonder if that could be related. Now I'm a Western trained MD, so I'd never had a single class on sleep. I didn't know anything about sleep. I knew what Ambien was, like I knew the mechanism of action of it, and that was it. Like I'm like, well, let me see if the side effects of the Ambien could be causing any of this. And then I started trying to look into that, and I realized how little I knew about sleep. And I realized, well, I don't even know enough about sleep to know how Ambien is affecting sleep, because it's not like it's one thing, right? And before I learned anything about sleep, I just thought of sleep like everybody else does. It's one thing, right? The switch goes off and the switch comes back on, and everything between that's just sleep.
Yeah.
It's like, no, there is a florid amount of like variation. Like there's so much craziness and so much change and interchangeability in during your sleep. It's equally as active as being awake. And I just didn't understand any of that. So fortunately, this was 2009. So the SEALs already had, they already had, similar to their reputation, the sort of the celebrity, quasi-celebrity status that SEALs have. And so I could watch a TED Talk or go to a lecture or read somebody's book, and I could call them and say, hey, I'm the doctor for the West Coast SEAL teams, and I was wondering if I could, train with you, or, if I could I come do a proctorship with you? Could I consult on clients with you, whatever? Every single one of them said, yeah. And so I just got to learn from the who's who of the integrative functional medicine world, and anything to do with sleep that was relevant. After I learned enough, I said, well, like I wasn't naive enough to think that sleep would solve every problem, but Occam's razor, right? Whatever has the fewest assumptions is likely to be correct, or most correct. It did have the possibility of explaining any symptom or any problem that these guys were coming to me with. So once I figured that out, I was like, well, we really should get on this. And so my first order of action was to get everybody off of Ambien. And then once I got everybody off of Ambien and started getting them to value sleep more, they started getting some results. And then after some time, the leadership then caught on and said, all right, well, it seems like something really good going on here. Let's talk to this guy afterwards. Because I tried to talk to the leadership first, and I'm not, there's no hyperbole in this. I literally got laughed out of people's offices, and they were just,
Really?
they're like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. You're telling me that sleep is messing with these guys' hormones? Yeah, get out of here. You're like, how do we get this moron in our command, right?
Mhm.
And then of course it caught on over the years, and we got lots of really good results. And then they started, bringing me up in front of large groups to lecture. And then eventually, like after I got out of the military, they were paying me, like hiring me and flying me back to give lectures to the same people who were laughing me out of the office 10 years before. So
I'd love for you to dive a little bit more into what you meant by sleep is almost as active or is just as active as when we're awake. Because I think a lot of us do have that assumption like, oh, when we sleep, it's just we kind of turn off, we sleep, and then somehow we wake up. But what's happening between that falling asleep and waking up, or what should be happening?
So I'll give you something philosophical first, and then I'll do something a little more practical. But these are all similes and metaphors that have taken me 10 to 12 years to develop. So and this one really came to me quite recently, just within the last couple of years. When people ask me what does it mean to be asleep? Like what happens when you're asleep? I can flip that and very easily say, and this is an identical argument. This is actually the most perfectly aligned simile I've ever heard in my life. I could flip that and say, what does it mean to be awake? Like, what happens when you're awake?
Mhm.
Everything, right? Like everything that you know of happens while you're awake, like everything, right? So that's sort of the philosophical idea of it, is like, it's a different experience of being human, being asleep, but it's
Mhm.
exactly like being awake. It's just this other thing that, like, everything's going on while you're asleep and everything's going on while you're awake. But more specifically with sleep is that, sleep is sort of this contract that we're born into. We didn't get to approve it or have our lawyers read it or anything. It's like you're born into it. And the contract says, and this is, of course, as an adult, as a child, sleep needs are drastically different. But sort of once you hit adult, completely formed brain and so forth, once you kind of hit that level of life, the contract is it takes 8 hours to recover from 16 hours of being awake, alert, and active. So as we're running around in the world doing things that we do, like this podcast, for instance, like I'm expending energy. I'm using resources. Some of the resources I've eaten and taken into me today. And a lot of these resources are coming out of my cells in ways that I have them stored, right? And at some point, I will run out of everything that I have stored. And if I don't eat anymore, I'll run out of all of that. And then I'm going to be what's called catabolic, right? I'm going to start using my body as my own fuel source. I'm going to start eating myself in order to stay alive, in a biological sense, obviously. If we then just extrapolate that a little and just take a little turn to that and say, all right, well, instead of staying up and not eating, like let's say instead of staying up for 4 days and not eating anything and running out of resources that way, what if we just don't sleep 2 hours as much as we need, right? What if we sleep 6 hours instead of 8 hours? And so every night we're just shorting ourselves 2 hours. Now keep in mind that's 25%, right? 25% of every night we're shorting ourselves. How many of those can you add up and still be healthy? How many of those can you add up and still be alive even, right? Like, because we just said that the contract is set, it takes 8 hours to recover. So the entire purpose of me going to sleep tonight, like the entire reason this design works out, is because if I stay up for 16 hours and then I do everything right and I allow my body to recover tonight while I'm asleep, my brain and my body can fully recover, I'll wake up tomorrow just as good as I am today, if not slightly better. I might have learned a little something, got a little bit better at something, and then tomorrow has a potential of being a better day. If I use today as my template of what I'm going to do tomorrow and I go to sleep for 8 hours tonight, I should wake up better able to do tomorrow than I was today, because it's like I've repaired a little. Now, I've optimized myself a little bit, right? Now, at some point, we can't do that anymore. When we're kids, we see it, right? When we see a little kid we see our kids wake up better. They wake up taller. They wake up smarter. They wake up faster. They wake up more energetic. They were like, you can see them growing, right? Like they're improving every day, and they're sleeping more than we are as well. And then as an adult, you can kind of see it plateau till maybe mid 30s. And then after kind of mid 30s, you start noticing a little bit of decline. It's like a lot of that's probably just not getting enough sleep, not valuing sleep enough, a little too much stress, a little too much alcohol, poor life choices, whatever. There's lots of things adding up to that. But at some point in our life, that 8 hours doesn't bring us up to 100% anymore. Maybe it brings us up to 99.6. And then and then if we do get 8 hours every night, then we're getting 99.6, 99.6, 99. So we're losing that 0.04% every day over the course of years. And that's really what we call aging, right? We're not quite recovering every day. So we're waking up a little less tomorrow than we were today. And then as we get older, sleep gets worse, sleep quality gets worse, and our ability to recover gets worse, and we wake up, noticeably different, in a pretty short amount of time. You can tell like somebody's aged a year. You can see that year if they're 80. If it's like 80 to 81, you can see that year. And so that's really the whole concept of it. Now, what's actually happening is when you go to sleep at night, we've broken it down into stages, and the way we know about these stages, it's like anything else in biology, it's just descriptive, right? We studied everything we could. We put electrodes on you, put cameras on you, heart rate, respiratory rate, your EEG of your brain, pulse ox, actigraphy to track your movement. Like we just keep adding things that we can observe. And then we combine that all into scientific data, and we say, well, this is what sleep looks like. And when all these observations are met, we call that stage 1. And when all these observations are met, we call it stage 2. And the way it goes is stage 1 is like pre-sleep. So pre-sleep is when we're all familiar with this. Like we kind of feel sleepy, and we go and we get in bed, and our intention is to go to sleep, and we're laying in bed, and we can still hear stuff. We can still pay attention, right? Like we could if we wanted to. Like we can hear people in the next room, or we can hear the neighbor's television, or whatever. We can hear things, but we aren't really processing it the same way. Like we realize that we're not really processing it the same way. We're somewhere in between sleep and wake. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is actually a complete loss of your senses. And ironically, the best definition of sleep really is this lack of wakefulness, like lack of being awake. And what it really means is that all of our there's a barrier between us and our environment, and the barrier between us and our environment is our interpretation of our senses, right? Our senses still work, obviously, right? Our eyes still work, our ears still work. Or the reason you can turn on a light and wake somebody up, the reason you can make a noise and wake somebody up is because everything's still working. We're just not paying attention to it anymore. So in stage 2, we've pretty much lost all of the attention and processing of our senses. But our brain waves, like our brain pattern, our EEG, looks pretty close to like being awake. And then we drop down into stages 3 and 4 sleep, which are the deeper, slow wave sleeps, and our brain's getting these really rhythmic waves going across the brain, right, from one side to the other. And the slower the frequency, the deeper the sleep, we call it. And then if you think about that sort of a plateau, so it's kind of like stair steps. If time is on the x-axis, we're doing stage 1, and we're going to stage 2, then 3, then 4, and then it's going to travel across the floor of that for a while, and then we're going to come back up from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, and then we're going to go up into REM. And once we go from stage 1 to the end of a REM, we then call that one sleep cycle.
Okay.
And that one sleep cycle has all of those things in it. Now, when we first go to sleep, about 80% of that sleep cycle will be deep sleep, slow wave sleep. And about 10 to 20% of it will be REM sleep. And then the next sleep cycle, so that's about 90 to 120 minutes. And then we'll go into another sleep cycle. And then that one will be a little less deep, a little more REM. And then that pattern keeps going throughout the night, and to where the last sleep cycle, right before you wake up, is about 80 to 90% REM and about 10 to 20% deep. Now, what's going on in deep sleep is actually biologically the exact opposite of fight or flight. So if you think about fight or flight, we have the autonomic, which you can think of as automatic nervous system. You have the autonomic nervous system, which is balancing things that we aren't thinking about, right? Like our heart rate and our respiratory rate and blood pressure and all that stuff. And sympathetic tone, that's the scared tone, right? That's the amygdala, that's the alert, that's the danger. And maximum sympathetic tone is what we call fight or flight. And what fight or flight does is essentially makes your body superhuman, kind of shuts your brain off and makes you a machine that is designed to get out of a bad situation. And you're going to use all your resources to get away from the tiger or the guy with the gun or to avoid the car crash or whatever it is that's causing this maximum stress. You're going to use 100% of your resources. You're 100% catabolic. You're like everything is about survival of the organism for this next very short bit of time.
Sure.
Deep sleep is exactly the opposite. Deep sleep, you have almost no stress hormones and you're maximally parasympathetic and your body's essentially useless, but you're hugely anabolic. You're flushing out all the waste products. You're producing growth hormone. You're producing testosterone. It's converting to DHT. Your growth hormone is going to IGF-1. Your insulin sensitivity is maximally effective, the best you're going to have all day. Your digestion's going. Your immune system's cranking. You're maximally anabolic and you're repairing your body and you're getting rid of waste products. Astrocytes in your brain that hold the structure of your brain, those neurons, they shrink about 30% and they cause these little channels of fluid to be able to flow through, and your cerebral spinal fluid flows through and it flushes out your waste products and you're actually getting better, right? You're becoming more anabolic. And most people know when you exercise, you don't get stronger when you exercise, right? You get weaker when you exercise because you're damaging the tissue. So how does that work? Well, when you go to sleep and you get deep sleep and you get all that anabolic activity and you flush out all those waste products and you start bringing in all the nutrients and all the eicosanoids and all the other signal messengers, like everything that's coming in there to repair that tissue, and you build that tissue back stronger or more enduring, depending on however you're exercising it. And then you stringing a couple of those nice together, and then that muscle fiber is actually thicker, or it has more mitochondrial density, or it has some better receptor, more GLUT4 receptors, or whatever it is to make it more adaptive to what you're training it to do. When we come out of that deep sleep and we go into a REM cycle, the same thing's happening to our brain. And we're rehearsing things that we've learned. We're getting rid of useless stuff that we've learned. We're taking stuff that we learned or things that we experienced. We're reanalyzing them. We're reanalyzing the emotional content of them and categorizing the emotional content of that. Like, should the fact that my spouse left his socks on the floor make me want to divorce him? Or is that just like a little glitch? Requires a little head bumping here and there, right? And so another thing that happens during that is we form these durable tracks. So if you think about everything you learn in a day or maybe even a week, so everything you've just kind of been associated learning with, you're just sort of getting some information on, think of that as like a little rodent trail, that's like a little rabbit trail at best, but probably like a little mouse trail or something. And then once your brain decides that that's important, it'll carve that into a little path, right? Like a footpath. And now you have a durable pathway, which makes it really easy to get from here to here, right? You can get there way faster, way more reliable. You know what's on the way. It becomes a known entity. And then the other thing that it does is it allows you to compare stuff that you already know with what you've just learned. And that's a deeper understanding. It allows you to understand things in a different way and make connections that you were never taught. So that's what's going on when you're sleeping. When you cut off sleep, you're cutting off some or all of that. Now I ask you, what's more important than that, right? Now, I didn't get into everything super technical, but the same thing is happening with all your nutritional needs, right? That's what actually when your fuel partitioning is happening. And in that deep sleep, when you're maximally anabolic, that's when you're setting leptin sensitivity. That's when you're setting ghrelin sensitivity. So all of the neuroregulation of your appetite, your food cravings, and what your body's actually going to desire and what you're going to eat and what you're going to do with those macros once you get them, all that's actually being determined during deep sleep as well. So if you're cutting yourself out of deep sleep, you're cutting yourself out of the most anabolic period of your life for your body. And then take that back a little bit to the philosophy that we started with when I was being high level philosophical about this. Okay, now you're getting 6 hours of sleep instead of 8 hours of sleep. What if you're losing 2 hours of deep sleep, right? And that was like your first sleep cycle. How good are you tomorrow? Or take it to the other extreme, and this is more likely. If you go to bed really late, if you go to bed later than you should, you're going to lose probably deep sleep. If you wake up a lot earlier than you should, you're going to lose a lot of REM sleep. Well, now you've lost the ability to sort of take from your short-term and working memory into your long-term memory and consolidate that into other stuff that you learn and actually use that information to perform at life better tomorrow. You're losing that, but you're also losing the emotional categorization of events. And something I didn't even get into, it changes a lot to do with your neurochemistry, which changes your perception of your senses to include your smell, your sight, your touch, everything. And your ability to understand other people, like your ability to judge people's faces, judge people's emotions, judge the tonality of somebody's voice, your ability to communicate your intentions well, and your ability to perceive other people's intentions and thoughts, that gets diminished by losing REM sleep as well. You can take monogamous couples that know each other really well, take 2 hours of sleep away from one of them, let them spend the whole day together in a pleasant environment. And this research has been done many times. And then at the end of the day, evaluate, take them in separate rooms and just ask them a bunch of questions like, how was your partner today? How were they communicating? How connected did you feel? Like, how were they their normal selves? Are they happier than they usually are? Are they less happy than? And it doesn't matter which one you sleep deprived. They both thought that the other one was worse that day. So how much of that can you endure, right? Yeah. Like, let's say you're only losing 5%. Okay. 5% over how many nights? The average American sleeps 6 hours. So that's if it's 5%, it's 5% a day for their whole adult life. And, it's tragic. It's tragic. I mean, I have to be really cautious to not turn people off and by what they would perceive as overstating it, but you cannot overstate the importance of sleep. Sleep is essentially what makes you capable of being who you are. And it sets your capabilities. Like, your capability is 100% determined by how well you sleep. There's a reason that we use it as an interrogation and torture technique in wars and so forth like that. Nothing breaks you faster than sleep deprivation. Nothing will make you better faster than recovering, from sleep deprivation. You essentially cannot do anything nearly as well without sleep, or without adequate sleep. You definitely can't thrive. You can survive, but you definitely can't thrive.
Well, that was just fascinating. The part that you brought up, saying, okay, when you first start sleeping, like 80% is dedicated towards deep sleep, and then 80 and 90% deep sleep, 10 to 20% REM sleep, and then by the end, that last sleep cycle, it's kind of flipped. And what was so interesting to me is when you were explaining the importance of both. I had heard for the last decade or so that, okay, the first half of the night is when your body recovers, the second half of the night is when your brain recovers, and that kind of matches up with what you were saying. So that's just really fascinating. I think that highlights the importance of, like you were just explaining, hey, it's really important that you get to bed on time, but it's also really important that you don't cut your sleep short in the morning either. Like, both ends bear equal weight for your overall health and well-being. So thank you for explaining that. That was really neat. My follow-up question to that is, well, what can people do to improve their sleep? Because, clearly people aren't getting enough sleep, but is it just sleeping more hours, or are there other things that can be done to help improve the quality of the sleep?
Obviously this is my profession, and I talk about this and work with clients and individual and sports teams and everything like that. And this is all I do all the time. And I can tell you that the number one factor to getting good sleep is understanding the importance of sleep. I do these annual health programs with people, and you could think of it like one of these television shows with the big health makeover, but it's a year-long reveal, right? Because we're changing everything about your life over the course of a year, and it's for people really who kind of traded their health for wealth for 20 years, and now they've they've got the money and they just want to recover and get their health back, whatever. But even these people, they know who I am. They've heard me on podcasts. They've seen me lecture. They've read my book, whatever. And they know who I am, and they're still resistant to me making them sleep 8 hours per night. And what I always say is, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to somebody who thinks their life's going great, but they want to be a little bit better, or somebody who thinks things are slipping away and they want to get back to normal, or people who are really down in the dumps and they're trying to get just some sort of happiness and health back. It doesn't matter. The most important thing is for you to understand how important sleep is. And I say that because it's not really that complex to get good sleep. And I'll cover that a little bit more in just a second. The only reason I bring up my clients is that the vast majority of my time, even knowing who I am when they sign up with me, the vast majority of my time is convincing them how important sleep is to them. I have to make it specifically to them. And so this is what everybody has to do. The good news is that unlike nutritional research or exercise research or mindfulness meditation research, any of the other sort of pillars of health, there's no controversy on sleep literature. You go to sleep research, you go to PubMed or Google Scholar and you look up sleep research, it all says exactly the same thing. Like there's nobody out there advocating for 4 hours of sleep a night. Like that's not a thing. I tell people, spend some time to figure out what your priorities are. And I don't care what they are, because whatever they are, sleep is drastically important to you achieving that. Like obviously most of us have at least imagined, if not articulated and written out, we've at least imagined a future version of ourselves in our environment that we would like to move towards. And so most things that we do, hopefully, are things that we believe are more are likely to make that imagined reality more likely. So we're moving towards some future intentionally for some reason. So there's some priorities in there. There's things that you have to do to get there. And it doesn't matter if your priority is to being a good parent, is it to make more money, is it to be healthier, is it like to run your first marathon, is it to be a better spouse, is it to look better naked, have better sex? Like, it doesn't matter. Whatever you want to do, list out 5 priorities. Now go to PubMed, go to Google Scholar and put in sleep and that thing, and just read until you're petrified. Once you start feeling slightly nauseous, then you can move on to the next one, and then you keep going until you're just like, you should be disturbed and uncomfortable at the end of this, going, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't know this. Why hasn't somebody told me? I think of how much of my life I wasted. How much that should be the feeling you'll get. And if you read enough, you'll get that feeling. So there's step 1. Now from there, the good news is it's easy, right? Okay. It's really easy. And it's easy because we're designed to do it, right? Like if you think about it, the earth is billions of years old. Some version of the human is millions of years old. This body is hundreds of thousands of years old. It's been evolving on this planet, and it's been evolving to use this planet as its fuel source and to know when to sleep and be awake. And we all use the sun. Every mammal on the planet uses the sun, as to know when to be asleep and when to be awake. And it's built into our DNA. We're genetically wired for it. All we have to do is get out of our own way. So you just think about, how would our ancestors live? Go back as far as you want. You don't have to go terribly far back, right? Go back 200 years. 200 years ago, what did they do when the sun went down?
Went to sleep.
They went to sleep, right? Like they maybe lit a candle and read a few pages out of the Bible or something, and then they went to sleep. Like, there wasn't a whole lot to do. We know this through journaling. Like we know European countries, and we know even early American settlers. Like, we have journaling from that. Like, we know that people spent about 12 hours a day in bed during the winter, and about somewhere between 8 and 10 hours a day in bed in the summer. And that's the way the world worked. That's what people did, and that was normal behavior. Believe it or else, there are still plenty of hunter-gatherers that live in the world who have never experienced electricity. They've never seen a light bulb. They've never seen a flashlight, like nothing. They have no experience with this. And they still go out and they hunt animals, and they gather food, and they cook, and they mend their shelters and their clothing, and sharpen their tools, and play around and go to sleep on animal skin on the cave floor, and they get up and they do the same thing the next day. And there are thousands of these people around. And we've done some research on these people recently, and it's no surprise to anybody who's ever been camping. The sun goes down, and about 3 hours later, you feel like going to sleep, and you go to sleep, right? Mm-hmm. So what we know happens, and like I said, every mammal has its own mechanism for it, but we all use the sun as our cue. Whether you're nocturnal or diurnal like humans, like when the sun goes down, it either stimulates you to be awake or it stimulates you to be asleep, right? Or de-stimulates you to be asleep. So we have these ganglia, these nerve cells in the back of our eyes that have nothing to do with vision. All they do is they sense blue light. My guess is because the sky's blue. So once the sun goes down, the blue light goes down, that changes these nerve endings in the back of our eyes. It sends this pathway to the back of our brain, causes this gland in the back of our brain to secrete a hormone most people have heard of called the pineal gland. It secretes melatonin, and melatonin is like this starter pistol that starts changing all these hormones in our brain. And about 3 hours later, we feel like going to sleep. Now, what else happens? So if the blue light goes out of our eyes, we know that pathway is going to happen. One of the things when melatonin gets secreted, one of the neuropeptides that changes a lot is something called GABA, capital G-A-B-A, all capital letters, stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. Not important. There's no test on that. But what GABA does is it slows down the neocortex. The neocortex being that wrinkly bit of the brain that we think of when we think of a human brain. What does it look like? Like that outer shell, that's the neocortex. The lizard brain sits in the middle of that, right? GABA slows that region down because why? That region does all of our sensory and our motor, and it processes all of that. Now, I just said what happens when you sleep. We turn all of that off. So GABA lowers the resting potential of all those neurons, makes those neurons harder to fire so that we're paying less attention to our environment. We can still feel everything. We can still move. We can still do everything, but we're numbing it down. Like we're dumbing it down a little bit. So there's two things. Melatonin, right? Blue light leads to melatonin, melatonin leads to GABA. Now, what else happens when the sun goes down? It gets colder. Their body temperature drops a little bit. That's sleep hygiene.
I love
those
it.
Those three things. Everything you've ever read or heard about sleep hygiene fits into one of those three things. You can do anything you want to, but the whole idea, and the reason I don't get into very specifics about, well, blue blocking glasses and this on your computer screen and that, and cover your windows and these kind of light bulbs, like you can go on for that forever, but all I really need you to know is understand that concept, and then you can figure out how that applies to you. There's another simple way to think about this, and it's just completely tied in, and I'll run through it really quick. But if you've ever had kids, and it sounds like y'all do, if you ever had a little kid or if you've ever been a little kid, you might remember that there's this protracted bedtime, this protracted period where you get ready to go to bed. You don't take a 2-year-old who's like smashing things with a hammer and just throw them in the bed, turn off the light, walk out of the room and expect that to work. Is that going to work? No. Why is it going to work? We all know it's not going to work. Of course it's not going to work. Well, why do we think we can do it as adults? We can't. So what do? We say, okay, we're going to dim down the lights. We're going to make things less stimulating, right? You can overcome any of those three things I said, right? You can put blue lights in your eyes, you can stimulate yourself, and you can keep yourself warm. You can keep yourself warm, right? When you can take the blue light out of your eyes and go off to happy hour with your friends and be watching televisions and checking out girls and drinking and laughing and now you've overcome the GABA thing, right? Mm-hmm. Or you can put a bunch of bright lights in your eyes, or you can just get rid of the total temperature issue. So you can overcome any of this stuff. So what do we do to kids? We dim down the lights. We say, okay, less stimulation. You're going to work with puzzles and crayons and, whatever, drawings. You're going to do low intensity stuff for a while. Then I'm going to put you in a bathtub. Why? Well, because that feels good. It's soothing, but it also drops your body temperature. You don't give your kid a 99-degree bath, right? You give your kid an 80-degree bath. So you're dropping their body temperature down. Then you pull them out of the bathtub and you put them in onesie pajamas. Why? because it's consistent. It's like one constant thing. There's no seams. And then you put powder in there, and now there's less sensitivity to their skin. There's less for them to not sense. There's less of them to not think of. Then you put them in a bed, and you put them in a comfy bed, hopefully, right? And then mom or dad gets next to them and makes them feel really comfortable and safe. And then you read them a story. What do you read them? You read them Jack the Ripper, no, you read them something that they know. You read them a story they've heard a million times, because it's not about the story. It's about the rhythmic entrainment of their brain, something predictable, something to help them wind down, to help them stop thinking about other things and settle down. And that's why Dr. Seuss works so great, because it's like an interesting story. It has this great tonality to it, has a little bit of rhyme into it. And then once all of that's settled and everybody's calm, cool, and relaxed, and sensations down and lights are down and body temperature's down, now you can assure them you love them, turn the lights off and walk out of the room, and it works. That's adult too. It's just, you don't have to wear onesies. You can if you want, but you don't need to.
I love it. Well, Dr. Parsley, thank you so much for all of this. Where can people find out more about you? Where can they connect with you, learn about your services?
Just go to my website, docparsley.com. So DOC, short for doctor, obviously, Parsley, like just one word, docparsley.com.
I love it. I love it.
All my social media stuff's there, TED Talks, podcasts, blogs, my sleep products, supplements, eye masks, like anything you want. Like all things Kirk are there.
I love it. I love it. So the question that we like wrapping up with for all of our guests is, Dr. Parsley, what is your definition of health?
My definition of health is being the most capable that I can possibly be for the activities that I value.
Hey there, it's Charlie again. One last thing. I want to let you in on a secret project that I've been working on for quite some time now. I am planning on releasing a book by the middle of summer 2021. But here's the thing, because I'm self-publishing this book, there's only going to be a limited number of copies available at any given time. So to learn more about this book and to be one of the first to find out when this book actually gets released, what I need you to do is go to exerciseforlifemethod.com. There you'll find out more information as well as some exclusive bonuses that I'm offering just for simply staying in the loop with what's going on with this book. So to learn more and claim your bonuses, go to exerciseforlifemethod.com, enter in your information, and you'll be automatically kept up to date. Learn all about the book and bonuses at exerciseforlifemethod.com. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Cates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.